You talk about combat like you've been there. But have you ever even seen a helicopter up close? Private Jackson's voice dripped with contempt as he challenged Staff Sergeant Rachel Mitchell in front of the entire training class. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably, some smirking at his audacity, others sensing they were witnessing something that would end badly for someone. Rachel stood perfectly still, her weathered hands clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable. What Jackson and the others couldn't see was the intricate tattoo hidden beneath her regulation uniform, a Black Hawk helicopter, surrounded by dates and coordinates that told a story of courage in the darkest corners of Afghanistan. If you've ever been doubted by people who've never walked in your boots, if you've ever carried the weight of classified missions that you can never fully explain, then you know the power of letting your actions speak louder than your words. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover what happens when the quiet ones finally reveal why they stay silent. And trust me, you'll want to share this with anyone who's ever been called a fraud by people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in their world. Fort Campbell in autumn carried the weight of history in every building, every training ground, every memorial that marked the sacrifices of the 101st Airborne Division. The base hummed with the constant rhythm of helicopters taking off and landing, the sound as familiar to its inhabitants as their own heartbeats. It was here, among the elite units that defined Army aviation, that Staff Sergeant Rachel Mitchell had been assigned as a combat instructor. Rachel didn't look like what the recruits expected from someone with her credentials. At 34, she was compact and wiry, with prematurely gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. Her uniform was always regulation perfect, her bearing professional but not imposing, and her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from experience rather than rank. The problem was that her experience was largely invisible to the young soldiers she was tasked with training. Rachel's personnel file was heavily redacted, her deployment history classified at levels that prevented casual inquiry, and her approach to instruction was methodical rather than dramatic. She taught combat tactics with the precision of someone who'd learned them the hard way, but she never shared the stories that would have explained how she'd learned them. "I served where I was needed," was her standard response when recruits asked about her background. It was technically accurate, but frustratingly vague, leaving room for speculation and doubt among soldiers who expected their instructors to regale them with war stories and personal anecdotes. The whispers began within the first week of her assignment. Private Jackson, a 20-year-old from Texas with more attitude than sense, was the first to voice what others were thinking. "She doesn't talk like someone who's seen real combat," he told his buddies during a break in training. "Real veterans love to tell stories. She acts like she's hiding something." The speculation grew with each passing day. Some recruits theorized that Rachel was a paper pusher who'd been promoted beyond her abilities. Others suggested she was a diversity hire who'd never seen combat but had been given an instructor position to fill quotas. The most creative minds invented elaborate backstories involving administrative errors, political connections, or bureaucratic incompetence. Rachel was aware of the whispers, but chose not to address them directly. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, that credibility was earned through actions rather than words, and that the truth had a way of revealing itself when it mattered most. She focused on her job, teaching young soldiers the skills they'd need to survive in combat and let the gossip swirl around her like background noise. Her teaching style was methodical and thorough, emphasizing fundamentals over flashy techniques. She taught helicopter insertion and extraction procedures with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she'd done it many times before. She covered combat communications with the expertise of someone who'd coordinated complex operations under fire. She explained survival techniques with the practical knowledge of someone who'd used them in real situations. But she did it all without the dramatic flair that many instructors use to hold their students' attention. Rachel's approach was professional, competent, and somehow unsatisfying to recruits who wanted their training to feel like scenes from action movies. "She's boring," complained Private Martinez after a particularly thorough lesson on helicopter safety protocols. "She knows her stuff, but she teaches like she's reading from a manual." The criticism was unfair, but understandable. Rachel's careful, methodical approach to instruction was the result of hard-won experience with the consequences of cutting corners or skipping steps. She'd seen what happened when soldiers weren't properly prepared, when training was treated as entertainment rather than education, when the difference between life and death came down to details that seemed boring in a classroom but were crucial in combat. As weeks passed, the skepticism about Rachel's background hardened into something approaching hostility. Private Jackson had emerged as the ringleader of the doubters, using his natural charisma and aggressive personality to influence other recruits. He questioned Rachel's instructions, challenged her explanations, and made increasingly bold comments about her qualifications. "I bet she's never even been on a helicopter," he told his growing audience of supporters. "Probably got all her knowledge from YouTube videos and training manuals." The comments were loud enough for Rachel to hear, but she continued to ignore them. Her response to Jackson's provocations was the same as her response to everything else: professional, measured, and focused on the mission of training soldiers rather than defending her own reputation. This restraint was interpreted by some as weakness, by others as evidence that Jackson's accusations might be true. If Rachel really had the combat experience her position suggested, why wasn't she defending herself? Why wasn't she putting Jackson in his place with stories of her own heroism? The truth was more complex. Rachel's combat experience was classified at levels that prevented her from sharing most of it. The operations she'd participated in were still sensitive. The techniques she'd used were still classified, and the people she'd served with were still operating in dangerous environments. She couldn't defend herself with war stories because most of her war stories were state secrets. More importantly, she'd learned that real combat veterans often had complicated relationships with their experiences. The soldiers who talked the most about their service were often the ones who'd seen the least action. Those who'd been tested in the crucible of actual combat were more likely to carry their experiences quietly, understanding that some stories were too important to be reduced to entertainment. Rachel's tattoos told part of her story, but they were hidden beneath regulation uniforms and long sleeves. The ink on her skin carried the weight of missions that couldn't be discussed, comrades who couldn't be named, and sacrifices that couldn't be quantified. But as long as those tattoos remained hidden, her credibility remained in question. The situation came to a head during a training exercise on helicopter insertion procedures. Rachel was demonstrating the proper technique for fast roping from a hovering aircraft, using a mock-up that simulated the conditions soldiers would face in real operations. Her explanation was thorough and technically accurate, but Jackson saw an opportunity to escalate his challenge to her authority. "This is all theoretical," he announced loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "She's teaching us about something she's never actually done." Rachel paused in her demonstration, her hands still gripping the rope. "Private Jackson, do you have a question about the procedure?" "Yeah, I do," Jackson replied, emboldened by the attention he was receiving. "I want to know when you've actually done this for real. When have you fast roped from a helicopter in combat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The other recruits watched with the fascination of people witnessing a confrontation that could go very badly for someone. Rachel's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested that Jackson was approaching a line that shouldn't be crossed. "I've done it when it was necessary," she replied simply. "That's not an answer," Jackson pressed. "That's what someone says when they're making stuff up." The tension in the training facility was palpable as Jackson's challenge escalated beyond the bounds of military courtesy. Other recruits watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as he openly questioned their instructor's credibility in terms that bordered on insubordination. "You know what I think," Jackson continued, his voice rising with confidence. "I think you're a fraud. I think you've never seen combat, never been in a helicopter under fire, never done any of the things you're teaching us to do." Rachel stepped down from the training platform, her movements controlled and deliberate. She faced Jackson directly, her expression calm despite the gravity of his accusations. "Private Jackson, you're out of line." "Am I?" Jackson shot back. "Because I'm not the one pretending to be something I'm not. I'm not the one teaching combat techniques I've never used." The other recruits were beginning to sense that Jackson had gone too far, but he was too caught up in his own momentum to recognize the danger. He'd been building to this moment for weeks, and now that he had the opportunity to expose what he saw as Rachel's deception, he wasn't going to back down. "Prove it," he demanded, his voice carrying across the training facility. "Show us your deployment gear, your combat patches, your awards, or admit that you're just another desk jockey who got promoted beyond her abilities." Rachel stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her breathing controlled. She'd faced this kind of challenge before, though never from someone under her command. She knew that her response would define not just her relationship with Jackson, but her credibility with every soldier she'd be responsible for training. "Private Jackson," she said quietly, "you have no idea what you're asking for." "I'm asking for the truth," Jackson replied. "I'm asking you to prove that you're qualified to teach us about combat." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Rachel looked around the training facility, taking in the faces of the recruits who were watching this confrontation unfold. Some looked embarrassed by Jackson's behavior, others seemed curious about how she'd respond, and a few appeared to be waiting for her to finally reveal the credentials that would silence her critics. Rachel made a decision that would change everything. Without saying a word, she began to remove her field jacket, her movements deliberate and precise. She folded the jacket carefully and set it aside, then began to roll up the sleeve of her uniform shirt. "You want proof?" she asked, her voice carrying a quality that none of the recruits had heard before. "Here's your proof." The tattoo that emerged as she rolled up her sleeve was a work of art that told a story of service in the most elite units of the Army. A Black Hawk helicopter dominated the design, rendered in intricate detail that captured every line and curve of the aircraft. Around it were dates, coordinates, and call signs that meant nothing to most observers, but everything to those who understood military aviation. Below the helicopter, in script that was both elegant and bold, were the words that made every soldier in the room catch their breath: 160th SOAR, and beneath that, Night Stalkers don't quit. The silence that followed was absolute. Every recruit in the training facility recognized the significance of what they were seeing. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment was the most elite helicopter unit in the Army. The Night Stalkers, who flew the most dangerous missions in the darkest corners of the world. Jackson's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He'd been challenging not just any instructor, but someone who'd served with the legendary unit that other soldiers spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. The tattoo on Rachel's shoulder was more than just ink and artistry. It was a credential that couldn't be faked, a symbol that had to be earned through service in conditions that most soldiers couldn't imagine. The dates and coordinates surrounding the Black Hawk told stories of missions that were still classified, operations that had taken place in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Captain Torres chose that moment to enter the training facility, conducting one of his routine inspections of the instruction programs. He took one look at Rachel's exposed tattoo and stopped dead in his tracks, his face going white with recognition and something approaching awe. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You're that Mitchell." The words hit the assembled recruits like a physical blow. Captain Torres wasn't just any officer. He was a veteran of multiple deployments, someone whose opinion carried weight with everyone on the base. His recognition of Rachel's tattoo, his obvious shock at seeing it, confirmed what the recruits were beginning to understand. They'd been in the presence of someone whose service record was legendary. "Sir," Rachel said, beginning to roll her sleeve back down, "I was just—" "No," Captain Torres interrupted, his voice filled with respect. "Don't cover it up. These soldiers need to see this. They need to understand who they've been learning from." He turned to address the recruits, his expression serious. Staff Sergeant Mitchell served as a crew chief with the 160th SOAR. She flew some of the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan, including the rescue operation that saved an entire platoon that was pinned down behind enemy lines. The story that emerged over the next few minutes transformed everything the recruits thought they knew about their instructor. Rachel had been part of a crew that had flown into a hot landing zone under heavy enemy fire, evacuated wounded soldiers while taking fire from multiple directions, and returned to base with their aircraft damaged, but their mission successful. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, Captain Torres continued, but she requested that her records be sealed after losing her crew in a crash during her final deployment. The last piece of information explained everything: Rachel's reluctance to discuss her service, her careful approach to instruction, her focus on safety and procedure over dramatic storytelling. She'd lost people she cared about. had survived when others didn't, and carried the weight of that survival in everything she did. Jackson stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He'd challenged a hero, questioned the credentials of someone whose service record made his own military aspirations look like childhood fantasies. The other recruits looked between him and Rachel, understanding that they'd witnessed something that would define the rest of their training experience. "Private Jackson," Captain Torres said, his voice carrying the cold authority of command, "you're dismissed from this training program. Report to the company commander immediately." Jackson left without a word, his military career effectively over before it had really begun. The other recruits watched him go, understanding that they'd just witnessed the consequences of letting arrogance override respect. Rachel rolled her sleeve back down and picked up her field jacket, her expression returning to the neutral professionalism that had characterized her instruction from the beginning. But something had changed in the dynamic of the room. The recruits who'd questioned her credibility now looked at her with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or manufactured. "Are there any other questions about helicopter insertion procedures?" she asked, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had always possessed, but now backed by the visible proof of her qualifications. There were no questions. For the first time since she'd begun instructing, the training facility was completely silent, except for the sound of soldiers paying attention to someone they finally understood deserved their respect. The revelation of Rachel's true background transformed not just her relationship with the recruits, but the entire culture of the training program. Word spread through Fort Campbell with the speed that only military gossip could achieve, and within hours, everyone on the base knew that the quiet instructor who'd been dismissed as a fraud was actually a decorated veteran of the Army's most elite aviation unit. Her training sessions, which had been sparsely attended and grudgingly endured, suddenly became the most sought-after instruction on the base. Soldiers who'd never shown interest in helicopter operations requested transfers to her program. Officers who'd overlooked her contributions began seeking her advice on tactical matters. The woman who'd been invisible became the most respected instructor at Fort Campbell, but Rachel handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism she'd brought to everything else. She didn't gloat about Jackson's downfall, didn't lecture the recruits about the dangers of making assumptions, didn't use her newfound credibility to settle old scores. She simply continued to do her job teaching soldiers the skills they'd need to survive in combat. "I'm not here to relive the past," she told the recruits who apologized for their earlier skepticism. "I'm here to make sure you all come home alive." The words reflected her understanding of what military service really meant. It wasn't about glory or recognition or proving yourself to doubters. It was about the sacred responsibility that came with training soldiers who would face real danger, real enemies, and real consequences for their preparation or lack thereof. Her teaching style evolved to incorporate more of her actual experience, though she remained careful about what she could share. She used examples from her deployments to illustrate important points, always changing details to protect operational security, but maintaining the essential lessons that could save lives. "When we were extracting that platoon," she told a class learning about hot landing zones, "the enemy had us zeroed in before we even touched down. The difference between success and failure was the crew chief's ability to coordinate with the pilots while returning fire and managing the wounded. Every second mattered. Every decision had consequences. The stories she shared weren't dramatic tales of heroism. They were practical lessons about the importance of training, preparation, and teamwork. She used her experience to teach rather than to impress, to educate rather than to entertain. The tattoo on her shoulder remained visible during training sessions, a constant reminder of the credentials that backed up her instruction. But it was no longer the only proof of her qualifications. Her teaching had gained a depth and authenticity that came from someone who'd actually lived the experiences she was describing. "She's different now," observed Private Martinez, one of the recruits who'd remained throughout the controversy. "Not because she's showing off, but because she's not holding back anymore. She's teaching us like our lives depend on it." The observation was accurate. Rachel's revelation had freed her from the constraints that had limited her instruction. She could draw on her full range of experience, could share the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving some of the most dangerous missions in military history. As months passed, Rachel's influence at Fort Campbell grew beyond her official duties as an instructor. She became an informal mentor to soldiers struggling with their own challenges, a resource for officers dealing with complex tactical problems, and a symbol of the quiet professionalism that defined the best of military service. Her story had also become a powerful teaching tool about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on limited information. The recruits who dismissed her as a fraud had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of respecting others regardless of their apparent credentials or lack thereof. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most qualified. She told a group of new instructors, "Real expertise doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up in the quality of the work, the depth of the knowledge, and the results that are achieved." The lesson extended beyond military service to life in general. Rachel's experience had demonstrated that people often carried invisible qualifications, hidden experiences, and untold stories that shaped their capabilities in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Her tattoo had become famous throughout the base, but not because of its artistic merit or symbolic significance. It was famous because it represented the truth that everyone carried marks of their experiences, some visible and others hidden, all of them part of the complex stories that made people who they were. "I get asked about the tattoo a lot," she told a visiting group of officers. "People want to know about the missions, the awards, the dramatic moments, but the real story isn't in the ink. It's in the lessons learned, the people saved, and the responsibility that comes with surviving when others don't." The responsibility she felt was evident in everything she did. Her instruction was meticulous because she understood that mistakes in training could lead to deaths in combat. Her approach was methodical because she knew that the fundamentals she taught might be the difference between mission success and mission failure. The crash that had ended her flying career remained a painful memory, but she'd found a way to honor her lost crewmates through her work as an instructor. Every soldier she trained, every life she potentially saved through her teaching was a tribute to the people who hadn't made it home. They died doing what they loved, She said simply when asked about her fallen comrades. The best way I can honor them is to make sure that other soldiers have the training they need to survive and complete their missions. The sentiment reflected her understanding of military service as something larger than individual achievement or recognition. It was about the continuation of a mission that transcended any single person's contribution, about the sacred trust that bound soldiers together across time and circumstance. 2 years after the confrontation that revealed her true background, Rachel Mitchell had become one of the most respected instructors in the Army. Her programs were used as models for other installations. Her techniques were incorporated into official training curricula, and her reputation had spread throughout the military aviation community. But her greatest achievement wasn't the recognition she'd received or the accolades that had come her way. It was the soldiers she'd trained, the lives she'd potentially saved, and the culture of respect and professionalism she'd helped create at Fort Campbell. The tattoo on her shoulder was no longer hidden beneath regulation sleeves. She wore it openly now, at least during training sessions, where it served as a constant reminder of the standards that military service demanded. But it was no longer the only proof of her qualifications. Her work spoke for itself. She changed how we think about credentials, observed Captain Torres, who had become one of her strongest supporters. She showed us that real expertise doesn't need to be advertised, that true professionals let their work do the talking. The lesson had broader implications for military culture. Rachel's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people by superficial characteristics, about the importance of giving everyone the respect they deserved regardless of their apparent status or credentials. Her influence extended beyond the soldiers she trained directly. The officers who worked with her learned to look for quiet competence rather than flashy credentials. The instructors who observed her methods learned to focus on substance rather than style. The entire base had been reminded that heroism often came disguised as humble service. The best warriors are often the quietest people in the room, she told a group of graduating recruits. They don't need to prove themselves because they've already done what needed to be done. They don't need to tell war stories because they're too busy preventing the next war. The words reflected her understanding of what military service really meant. It wasn't about personal glory or individual recognition. It was about the collective mission of protecting others, about the shared responsibility of ensuring that future generations could live in peace. Her tattoo had become a symbol of that understanding, a reminder that everyone carried marks of their service, some visible and others hidden, all of them part of the complex tapestry of military life. The Black Hawk helicopter inked on her shoulder represented not just her own service, but the service of everyone who'd chosen to put their lives on the line for others. As she continued her work at Fort Campbell, Rachel carried with her the knowledge that her story would outlive her service. The recruits she'd trained would carry her lessons to their own assignments, where they'd pass them on to the next generation of soldiers. The culture of respect and professionalism she'd helped create would continue to influence military training long after she'd moved on to other assignments. The real message isn't about tattoos or dramatic revelations. It's about the danger of judging others by appearances, the importance of giving everyone the respect they deserve, and the truth that real expertise doesn't need to announce itself. The loudest heroes are often the quietest people in the room, and sometimes the most important stories are written in ink on skin that's seen too much. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their quiet competence matters more than loud credentials. And remember, the next time you're tempted to judge someone's qualifications, look deeper. The person you're dismissing might be carrying experiences that would humble you and wisdom that could save your life.